Hannah and Cailin back again with Double Talk. If you know us well, you know that we're really into true crime, and we actually watch police interrogation tapes in our free time, which is how you know. So for today's Double Talk Asks, we're so excited to be talking to Richard A. Leo. He's a professor of law and psychology at the University of San Francisco, and he's an expert in police interrogation techniques. He's also done a lot of research on the psychology behind false confessions and why someone might confess to a crime that they didn't actually commit. So we're interested to learn more about that as well. Listen in. Richard, you are one of the leading experts in the world on police interrogation tactics and the psychology behind false confessions, which are two areas that we just find so fascinating, both of us. What motivated you to become so informed in this area of study?
Why would anybody falsely confess? Of course, many people think they would never falsely confess, but they don't know that police are trained to use highly manipulative interrogation methods. They've never been to an interrogation. They haven't read research on false confessions. Chances are they don't know somebody who's falsely confessed. So it's just an endlessly fascinating psychological and criminological problem with real-world consequences. And that's what got me into it, and that's what's kept me into it.
I was looking into what I consider to be one of the most gripping police interrogations with Colonel Russell Williams, and I came across the term the Reid Technique, and I did a little looking around the internet, and what I've decided is that it's just not something that I can really find a concise explanation of. Is that something that can even be explained in simple terms, what exactly the Reid Technique is?
I think it can be reduced to a simple explanation. I'll just give you a little history first, very briefly. In the 1920s and 30s and before that, there was something called the third degree. You've probably heard of it, where police back in those days were not very professional. They used very violent physical and psychological methods to extract confessions during interrogations. And in the 1930s and the 1940s, there was a movement afoot to reform police interrogation techniques in the United States. And the third degree quickly became outlawed. And in its place were police interrogation managers and professionals and leaders who started relying on the polygraph and on psychological methods of interviewing and interrogation. And Reid and Associates formed in the 1940s. Reid was a Chicago police officer and a polygrapher, and he teamed up with somebody named Fred Imbaugh, who had run what was then called a scientific crime detection laboratory and went on to be a Northwestern professor. And the two of them were writing these textbooks together on how to interrogate, Imbaugh and Reid. And that manual has become the Bible of interrogation, and it is referred to as the Reid method, and Reid started a firm called Reid and Associates. So they basically replaced the third degree with psychological methods of pressure and persuasion, and have been training and teaching detectives, public and private police, how to interrogate within the limits of law, or at least what they believe are within the limits of law, for decades. Here's what it boils down to. I'll try to do this in a paragraph or less, with some semicolons. So the Reid method is you judge people, their innocence or guilt, not exclusively, but primarily or centrally, based on their demeanor, their body language, whether they look to you guilty. And the Reid people suggest asking a series of questions. Who do you think you did this? Would you be willing to take a polygraph? What punishment should the person receive? And they're trying to trigger behavioral reactions that they associate falsely, according to the scientific literature, with guilt. And of course, they assume everybody who's liberal is guilty. So if you say you believe in rehabilitation and you think polygraphs are junk, you're guilty.
No, that's interesting because I remember, for example, in the Chris Watts interrogation with Tammy Lee, they said, what do you think should happen to the person who murdered his wife and two kids? And I remember, even though he was guilty, he responded by saying they should get the maximum sentence. So that's kind of the opposite of what they're going for there when they ask that question, right?
That's right. But their theory is the same theory of the polygraph, the so-called lie detector, which is just junk science.
It is?
Well, the polygraph is junk science, yeah. So the reason the lie detector is junk science is because all it does is measure physiological changes in your heart rate, your perspiration, in response to different questions. The physiological changes reflect emotional arousal, which may or may not reflect guilt. There's any number of possible explanations for emotional arousal. If you ask me emotionally arousing questions, I'm going to react, right? Any of us would. It might have nothing to do with innocence or guilt. The only way the polygraph would be legitimate is if we had a Pinocchio's nose response. In other words, if there was some physiological behavior that only occurred when we were lying, but there isn't, right? So increased sweating in your palms, increased heartbeat. The polygraph is a great tool of interrogation because people are scared of it and they think it can read their mind, which is what interrogators tell them. And so they confess. And that's the whole purpose, oftentimes. That's one piece of the Reid method. Another piece is presuming somebody's guilt, accusing them of committing crimes, cutting off their denials, and then coming up with some minimizing scenario. You did this because it was spur of the moment, it was just an accident, you did it in self-defense. And then getting the suspect, once they confess to that version, to confess to the version you want them to confess to. That would be the Reid method in, I hope, a sentence.
What would you say, though, when an interrogator will tell a person taking a lie detector test, the reason why I can tell when you're lying is because you set your own baseline?
The police cannot tell your baseline. Okay, they want the suspect to believe that they can read the suspect's mind, that they're an infallible human lie detector. That makes them better interrogators. But they can't read a suspect's baseline because they don't know the suspect's baseline of behavior. If you've lived with somebody your whole life, you know how they behave, but you still can't always tell whether or not they're lying or telling the truth. Behavior is very complex. So that is a myth that police delude themselves into believing, though the better ones know they're lying. And by the way, police are allowed to lie. They're allowed to lie about virtually everything in an interrogation, and they do. That is one of their many lies. It's perfectly legal. If you had a police officer here and they said, well, Professor Leo's anti-police, I said, no, I'm not anti-police. I'm describing what these guys do. They're trained to lie, and they do lie, and they're very proud of it. And the lie you've just described can be very effective at getting confessions.
I guess it would be the Reid technique, too, when interrogators will look at a person and say, you look like you have something that you want to get off your chest. They all say that. What about when they say, you seem like a nice guy? You seem like a nice guy. You seem like a good guy. That kind of thing. Is that also a part of the Reid technique?
You're a good guy. People will understand. I'm not here to judge you. We want to help you. That's all part of the minimization of blameworthiness to get the suspect to think it's not a big deal. People will understand. That is part and parcel, at the heart of the Reid technique.
It's hard for me to imagine why an innocent person would give a false confession. So I guess what I wonder is there a common thread between the type of people who tend to give a false confession? Is it something about their past? What is personality? Their personality. What is it about them that makes them falsely confess and think that that's somehow a better option than just maintaining their innocence?
Well, that's a really good question. Like all behavior, it's an interaction between the environment and the individual. The difference here, though, is most false confessions are the product of interrogations that involve a lot of pressure, typically, and persuasion. And so most false confessions are the product of being badgered and lied to and tricked and believing interrogators and thinking that the only way to get out of the room, go home, avoid a serious punishment is by telling them what they want to hear. And so first and foremost, interrogations are psychologically coercive. When you talk to false confessors, they almost always tell you they just wanted to go home. They just wanted to get out of there. They couldn't take the pressure anymore, and they were led to believe through these kinds of minimization techniques that I've mentioned to you, they were led to believe the consequences wouldn't be that big. And some will say they thought they could fight it later on, they'd get a lawyer, the evidence would prove their innocence. That's what explains most false confessions. Now, there are some individuals who are vulnerable, more vulnerable than others. Juveniles, for example, People under the age of 17, particularly under the age of 15 or 14, whole set of reasons there. People with intellectual disabilities, they're basically people with IQs under 70 who are very slow. And again, a whole set of reasons we can talk about why they're more vulnerable. And people with mental illnesses, again, a whole set of reasons why they're more vulnerable. And so if you have psychologically aggressive, coercive interrogations of the type I've described, or people with the kind of vulnerabilities that I've described, you're far more likely to get a false confession from somebody who can't withstand the pressure, and somebody who thinks they just want to, or somebody who thinks they just want to go home and get out of there, and that's the only way of doing it.
You've also done quite a bit of research on the impact of the Miranda warning, or the reading of your Miranda rights to somebody who's called in for questioning. I've never thought of this as being overly impactful beyond the person's decision to either remain silent or continue talking without a lawyer present. So what have you learned from your research on its impact?
Police deliver Miranda warnings in ways that are most favorable to them. And so they will downplay their significance. They will avoid giving them until they absolutely have to. And they'll try to game the Miranda warnings. It might say, you know these better than I do. You've seen this on television. It's not a big deal. So that's one thing. And the courts have allowed them to do that. The courts, the appellate courts, the Supreme Court have largely gutted the Miranda warnings as they were originally envisioned. Number two, or number three, depending on how you count, almost everybody waives their Miranda rights. People feel like they have an obligation, or at least a social expectation, that we speak to police. If they're innocent, they feel they'll be perceived like they have something to hide. Why wouldn't they talk to the cops? And if they're guilty of something, they want to throw the cops off. They think, again, that people will think they're guilty if they don't talk to the police. And a lot of people just don't understand their Miranda rights. The Miranda rights are pitched at an 8th grade level, but they're not explicit about everything. And a lot of the people who get caught in the net of criminal justice, of false confessions, sadly read below or think below or have IQs below an 8th grade level. Now, with respect to false confessions, Miranda makes almost no difference because almost everybody waives, and innocent people are more likely to waive than guilty people. In fact, Miranda, the people who invoke the Miranda rights tend to be people with criminal records, or more likely to be people with criminal records. So when we're thinking about systemic reform for minimizing false confessions and maximizing true confessions, right? That's what we really want. We want a system that gets more truthful statements in a fair way and fewer false statements. Miranda is not a very helpful reform. It doesn't achieve much in a factual sense.
What is illegal? What is off limits for a police officer who's trying to get a confession?
They can lie and say they're your friend. They can lie and say they're there to help you. They can lie and say we've got DNA or fingerprints or witnesses who implicate you, which is perhaps the most common lie, pretending to have evidence they don't have. The lies that would be impermissible would be if they threatened you. They said, look, if you confess, you're going to get, you're going to go free. You're not going to get prosecuted. But if you don't, you're going to get the death penalty or, life imprisonment. That would be impermissible or illegal because threats and promises are not allowed. I suppose if they pretended to be your lawyer or pretended to be a priest, you could, that would probably be impermissible as well, although that doesn't happen. And it's important to remember they're professional liars. That's what police interrogators are in our society. And I'm not defending this per se, but I just want to emphasize that this is the system the courts have set up.
Last question for you, Richard. Who would you consider to be the greatest interrogator of all time?
Maybe my mother.